Under a sky the color of pewter, the snow began again, soft, endless, and deliberate, like a secret being whispered by the earth itself. The valley lay quiet beneath it, hushed and reverent, as if even the wind feared to disturb the stillness. The pines bowed under its weight, their needles laced with frost that shimmered faintly in the dull morning light. Down in the hollow where the creek slept under a crust of ice, a cabin stood, small, stubborn, and alone, its chimney breathing slow ribbons of smoke into the gray air. Elihu Hawk Redfeather stood on the porch, a ghost of his own making. His dark hair was tied back, and his coat, heavy with age and use, bore the dust of 100 storms. The townsfolk called him the giant Apache, though he never called himself anything. He was taller than most men by a head, his shoulders broad, his eyes narrow as though accustomed to watching the horizon for trouble. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was with the weight of someone who had learned long ago that words were seldom worth the pain they caused. His world was the snow, the quiet, the flicker of firelight through cold nights. And yet even silence, when lived too long, grows sharp at the edges. It cuts deeper than noise ever could. The morning had been like any other, chores done in half-light, the sound of frozen leather, the bite of wind through the gaps in the boards. Hawk had been mending a fence rail when he saw movement down the slope, faint and strange. 2 figures against the white. They were walking, not riding, and the smaller of them stumbled often. He straightened, frowning. No one came this far out unless desperation was their companion. By the time the pair reached the porch, snow had crusted their shoulders and filled the seams of their clothes. The younger one, a woman, stood shivering, her face half hidden behind the edge of a shawl that had seen better winters. The man beside her leaned on a stick, his breath rasping like old paper, his hair white as the drifts beneath his boots. They looked as though the storm itself had spit them out. The woman's voice trembled when she spoke. "I was told," she hesitated, swallowing whatever pride she had left. "I was told you needed a wife." The words did not sound rehearsed. They were fragile, bare, and hung between them like breath in the cold. Hawk said nothing. For a long moment he only looked at her. Snow clung to her lashes, melting slowly against the warmth of her skin. Beneath the threadbare shawl, her dress was faded blue, patched at the hem, her hands red from cold and work. She was young, 24 perhaps, but her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone twice that. Behind her, the old man shifted, his cane slipping slightly in the snow. The woman turned her head toward him. "Pa, maybe we should." He coughed, a deep, rattling sound that stole the end of her sentence. Hawk moved instinctively, stepping forward to steady the man by the arm. "Inside," Hawk said quietly. "You'll freeze out here." The girl looked uncertain, as though entering might be a sin. But the wind howled through the trees then, fierce and sharp, and her hesitation broke. She nodded once and Hawk opened the door. The warmth of the cabin hit them like a soft blow. It smelled of smoke, leather, and old pine. A single lamp burned near the hearth, its flame fluttering as they entered. Hawk helped the old man, Rufus Bell as he would later learn, toward the chair near the stove, then turned to the young woman still standing by the threshold. "Hang your things there," he said, nodding to a peg on the wall. His voice was deep, steady, carrying an accent neither fully Apache nor fully white. She did as told, her movements careful, wary. Her fingers trembled as she removed her shawl, revealing hair the color of honey darkened by ash. Her face, though tired, was lovely in a quiet, unassuming way, high cheekbones, a small mouth pressed into resolve. Hawk poured coffee into 3 chipped mugs and set them on the table. The woman looked at hers as though it were a luxury she had no right to touch. The old man, meanwhile, stared at Hawk with eyes that still held some remnants of pride, though dulled now by hunger and age. "They said you needed someone," Rufus managed. "Someone to help around the place. My Lucinda's a good worker. Knows how to cook, so keep things tidy." "Lucinda." Hawk repeated the name in his mind but did not say it aloud. "I don't need anyone," he said simply. Rufus gave a small, tired smile. "Ain't about what you need, son. Sometimes it's about what God sends you when you ain't looking. Hawk didn't answer. He looked instead at the fire, its glow licking the stones. The sound of the wind outside filled the silence. After a while he said, "You can stay till the storm passes." Lucinda's eyes lifted at that. Gratitude flickered across her face, quick, restrained, but there. She nodded. "Thank you, sir." He nodded back. "Hawk," he said. "Not sir." As the hours passed, the storm worsened. Snow piled high against the windows, the world outside vanishing into white. Inside, the fire burned low, and the three of them shared the uneasy quiet of strangers bound by necessity. Hawk mended a harness at the table while Lucinda peeled potatoes with slow, deliberate care. Rufus dozed in the chair, his breath wheezing softly. Every now and then Hawk caught Lucinda glancing at him, quick and curious. He ignored it until she finally spoke. "You live here alone?" He nodded once. "Must get awful quiet." He looked up from his work. "Quiet's better than the things that fill it." She didn't ask what he meant. Her eyes drifted toward the fire again. After a moment she said softly, "We've been walking since dawn. My father sold the horse last week just to buy flour. Didn't last long." Hawk didn't respond. The truth in her voice didn't need comforting. It needed space. When Rufus stirred later, Hawk offered him a bowl of stew. The old man took it with shaking hands, murmured something that might have been thanks. Lucinda watched her father with a kind of helplessness Hawk knew too well, the look of someone who's seen their anchor begin to slip beneath the water. Outside, night fell heavy and blue. The wind keened through the gaps in the doorframe, and somewhere far off, a wolf howled, a low, mournful sound that seemed to belong to the valley itself. Lucinda stood and went to the window, her silhouette framed by the pale glow of snowlight. "It's strange," she said quietly. "The world looks softer when it's buried." Hawk looked up from the table. "Maybe it's just the only way it knows to hide what's broken." She turned, meeting his gaze fully for the first time. Something unreadable passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or the faint shock of seeing your own loneliness reflected in another's eyes. Rufus coughed again, breaking the moment. Hawk stood and stirred the fire, adding another log. "You should rest," he said to Lucinda. "There's a cot in the back." She hesitated. "What about you?" "I've got the chair." She looked as though she might argue, then thought better of it. "Thank you," she murmured and disappeared into the shadows. When the room had gone still, Hawk sat by the fire, staring into its restless heart. The flames danced and cracked, the scent of pine filling the air. He could still hear the faint sound of the woman's breathing behind the thin wall, a rhythm unfamiliar and strangely comforting. It had been years since another soul had slept under his roof. Years since anyone had spoken to him without suspicion or contempt. He should have felt intruded upon, unsettled. Instead, there was a quiet hum beneath his chest, a reminder that he was still human enough to care. He reached for the small wooden carving on the mantel, a falcon, wings half spread. His mother had carved it before she died, long before the war, before the soldiers came and burned everything they couldn't understand. He turned it over in his hands, its edges worn smooth by time. For the first time in months, the cabin felt like a place meant for more than survival. Hours passed. The storm began to ease, though the wind still whispered against the walls. Hawk dozed in the chair, his head bowed. Then came a sound, a soft creak. He opened his eyes to find Lucinda standing there in the dim firelight, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "The wind, it sounds like voices." He nodded toward the hearth. "Sit then. It'll fade by morning." She crossed the room quietly and sat near the fire, the light painting her face in gold and shadow. "You don't talk much," she said. He gave a small shrug. "Talk's cheap out here." Her eyes searched his face. "But you don't seem cheap, Mr. Hawk." He said nothing, but his lips twitched, almost a smile. For a long while they sat in silence, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. Outside, the storm's voice softened to a murmur. Inside, the air grew warm enough for her cheeks to flush. She glanced toward her father, sleeping soundly for the first time in days. "Thank you," she said again, quieter this time. He met her gaze. "Don't thank me yet." Something in his tone made her pause. "Why not?" "Because mercy always costs more than people think." The fire cracked sharply, sending sparks up the chimney. The words hung in the air, heavy and true. Lucinda lowered her eyes, drawing the blanket tighter. In the corner, Rufus stirred, his breath catching for a moment. Hawk's attention shifted toward him, just enough to miss the tear that traced a clean path down Lucinda's cheek. When the wind finally calmed, the cabin settled into a fragile peace. But outside, beyond the window's thin pane, shadows moved along the ridge, lanterns flickering in the snow, voices low and searching. Hawk rose slowly, eyes narrowing toward the glass. Someone else was coming through the storm. The morning broke pale and brittle, the air sharp as splintered glass. Snowlight crept through the small cabin window, laying itself gently across the worn planks of the floor. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt alive. Smoke rose from the dying embers in the stove, and in that dim warmth, Lucinda Bell stirred awake. For a moment she did not know where she was. The scent of pine, the faint hum of wind outside, the sound of a man moving somewhere nearby. Then memory returned like a slow ache. The long road, her father's labored breath, the knock on a stranger's door. Hawk was already up. He moved through the cabin with the quiet precision of someone who had learned to live without company. His boots made no sound on the wood. The morning light caught the sharp line of his jaw as he stoked the fire, the heat flaring briefly against his face. He wore a faded red flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing forearms scarred by years of work. Lucinda watched him from the doorway of the small room where she had slept, uncertain whether to speak. He noticed her anyway. Without looking up, he said, "Coffee's on the table." His voice was low, gravel rubbed smooth. She hesitated, then stepped forward, the boards creaking beneath her bare feet. Her father still slept on the cot, his breath uneven. She moved softly, poured herself a cup, and sat across from Hawk. The warmth of the mug felt foreign in her hands. "You're up early," she said. He gave a slight nod. "Animals don't wait for the sun." The silence that followed wasn't unfriendly, just vast like the open land outside. She took a sip and studied him. There was a stillness about him, not the kind born of peace but of careful restraint. He seemed carved from the same wood as the cabin itself, enduring, solitary, weathered by storms that left no mark but never truly passed. Lucinda wanted to ask about the figures she'd glimpsed through the window the night before, but something in his face stopped her. Instead, she said quietly, "Thank you for letting us stay." Hawk finally looked at her then, his eyes dark, unreadable. "Storm wasn't one you walked through. You did right knocking." She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Most doors don't open for us anymore." He didn't answer, but there was something like understanding in his gaze before he turned back to the fire. By midday the snow had begun to soften. The valley glittered under the pale sun, every tree limb dressed in diamonds. Hawk was outside splitting logs, his breath misting in the air. Lucinda watched through the small window as his axe rose and fell, each strike sure and rhythmic. There was beauty in his movement, an unthinking grace that belonged to people who lived by the rhythm of the earth. She envied that steadiness. Her own life had been nothing but uncertainty since her mother's passing and her father's slow ruin. When she stepped outside to hang their washing on the line, Hawk stopped for a moment, resting the axe against the stump. "Town's a ways off," he said. "You'll need supplies before the next snow." She glanced up at him, the cold stinging her cheeks. "I can go." He shook his head. "I'll ride in tomorrow. Bring what's needed." "You don't have to." "Not for you," he interrupted gently. "For the old man." Something softened in her expression. "He's not used to kindness. It makes him uneasy." Hawk looked toward the hills. "Kindness ain't easy for most folks." That night, Rufus coughed himself half awake, and Lucinda knelt beside him, wiping sweat from his brow. Hawk brought water, said nothing, only set it down and stepped back. His presence filled the room even in silence. When Rufus settled again, Lucinda rose to find Hawk still standing by the door, watching the snow fall beyond the glass. "You don't sleep much," she said. "Used to nights without walls," he replied. "Walls creak. Remind me of the past. Something bad." He gave a short breath of amusement. "Ain't no good past out here." She moved closer, drawn by the calm in his voice. "Then what keeps you here?" He turned to her. "The land don't lie. People do." For the first time she understood something of his solitude. It wasn't born from arrogance, but from survival. He had built his distance like a fence around a wound no one could see. The next day he left before dawn. Lucinda watched from the window as he rode off into the fading fog, the horse's hooves muffled by snow. The cabin felt emptier than it should have. She busied herself with chores, mending his torn coat, sweeping the floor, boiling water, but every creak of wind made her glance toward the door. Her father slept most of the day, whispering half-dreamed names from years gone by. It was late afternoon when she saw the tracks. Fresh ones near the tree line, 2 pairs of boots, not one. She knelt, brushing away powdery snow, her pulse quickening. Whoever they were, they had come close to the cabin and turned back. Too close. When Hawk returned that evening, his horse steaming, she told him. His expression didn't change, but his shoulders stiffened. He set down the supplies and went to the window, scanning the dusk. "Could be drifters," she offered, though her voice wavered. "Could be worse." He lit a lantern, the flame catching in his eyes like gold trapped in stone. "Town don't take kindly to what they don't understand," he said. "Half of them still think Apache blood's the devil's curse." Lucinda's stomach tightened. "You think they'd come here? For us?" He didn't answer. He only reached for his rifle, checked the chamber, then set it by the door. They'll come if they smell weakness. That night, the air inside the cabin felt heavy, taut as a wire. Lucinda cooked quietly, her hands shaking when she stirred the pot. Hawk sat by the fire, sharpening a knife, each drag of steel against stone a whisper through the room. The rhythm was strangely soothing. She broke the silence first. When I was little, my father told me people feared what reminded them of their own sins. Maybe that's why they hate you. Hawk looked up, eyes steady. And what do you think, Lucinda Bell? She hesitated. I think they hate what they can't own. The faintest ghost of a smile crossed his lips. That's a dangerous thought. I've had worse. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it the scent of pine and something distant. Smoke, maybe, or memory. Hawk stood, tossed another log onto the fire. You're not like most women I've met. Is that a compliment? It's a warning. The way he said it made her heart stutter, though she couldn't say why. She turned away, pretending to fuss with the pot. You don't scare me, Mr. Hawk. He stepped closer, his voice quiet. That's the part that scares me. For a moment, the space between them filled with the sound of the fire, the sharp rhythm of two hearts learning each other's language. Then Rufus stirred again and the spell broke. Hawk moved back to his chair as though nothing had passed at all. Later, after they'd eaten, Lucinda sat mending his gloves by the fire. Hawk watched her in the flickering light, her fingers deft, her brow furrowed in concentration. You sew like someone who's patched too many things, he said. She didn't look up. Things break when you're poor. You learn to make them last. He nodded slowly. Maybe people ain't so different. When she glanced at him, his expression had softened. There was no pity there, only recognition. The night deepened, the fire dimmed to coals. Hawk leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. Lucinda sat across from him, the lamplight painting her face in quiet gold. Outside, snow began again, fine, whispering flakes that drifted against the window like ghosts returning home. She thought of what he'd said about mercy, how it always cost more than people thought. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps this, whatever fragile thing had begun to stir between them, was mercy, and they were both paying for it in their own way. When she finally stood to retire, she paused at the doorway. Good night, Hawk. He opened his eyes. Good night, Lucinda. Her name sounded different on his tongue, soft, deliberate, like a promise he didn't mean to make. She turned away before he could see her smile. Outside, unseen, the wind shifted. In the distance, a single lantern flared to life among the trees, its light swaying like a watchful eye. Dawn arrived muted and uncertain, the world still wrapped in the hush of falling snow. The fire had burned to embers, its faint glow tracing soft shadows across the cabin walls. Hawk sat awake beside it, a silent sentinel with tired eyes. He'd slept little, haunted not by dreams but by memory, the kind that never fades, only shifts its shape. Outside, the horizon wore a pale bruise of light, and the pines stood like sentries keeping watch over everything he tried to forget. Lucinda stirred in the corner where she'd slept. Her hair was undone, a dark tangle against the blanket. She blinked into the light, slow and unsure, as though emerging from a dream too heavy to carry. When her gaze met Hawk's, she gave a small, polite nod, the kind given between two people who know they've shared something unnamed. Her father hadn't moved all night. Rufus Bell lay in the cot, his breath shallow and uneven, each rise of his chest more fragile than the last. The cough that had troubled him for days had deepened into something wetter, darker. Lucinda went to him at once, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. "Pa," she whispered, but his eyelids only fluttered. Hawk rose, poured water into a tin cup, and handed it to her. "He's fevered," he said. "I know," she murmured. Her voice trembled, though she tried to steady it. "He's been fighting it since before the storm. I thought rest might help." "Sometimes rest just gives sickness time to settle deeper," Hawk replied. Lucinda turned sharply, her eyes glinting. "You think I don't know that?" He met her anger without flinching. "Didn't say you didn't." The silence that followed was sharp but short-lived. She looked away first, shoulders softening. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm just tired." He nodded. "Tired don't need apologies." She dabbed her father's forehead again, her hands gentle, her lips moving in soundless prayer. Hawk watched her for a moment, how love made her fierce, how fear hollowed her out but didn't break her. He had seen men face death without trembling, yet this quiet strength moved him in a way he couldn't name. By afternoon the fever worsened. The storm had cleared, but the world outside was a frozen sea of white. Hawk saddled his horse and rode to town for medicine, though he knew the errand would draw more than snow-blind stares. Tumblebrush was awake when he arrived. Smoke rose from chimneys. Men clustered outside the saloon, stamping the cold from their boots. When Hawk dismounted, every conversation seemed to hush. He walked through them without slowing, their whispers chasing him like the tails of smoke. "Look who's crawled out of his hole. Half-breed's got a woman up there now. Preacher's daughter," someone said. "Shame don't freeze, it seems." Hawk ignored them. He entered the small general store where Sheriff Mason Harlow leaned at the counter, talking low to Tommy Greaves, the cattle broker with a smile too thin to trust. Both men turned when Hawk stepped inside. "Well, look who it is," the sheriff drawled. "Didn't think we'd see you, for spring thaw." "Need quinine," Hawk said simply. Greaves snorted. "That for you or your new company?" Hawk didn't rise to it. "Just the medicine." Harlow's eyes narrowed. "You know there's talk, Redfeather. Old Bell owed money all over this county. You hiding him?" Hawk's gaze didn't shift. "He's dying, not hiding." The sheriff smirked. "Convenient. Not for him." The tension hung like frost. Greaves broke it with a quiet laugh. "Careful, Sheriff. Man like that's half wolf. Might bite." Hawk dropped 2 silver coins on the counter. "Medicine," he repeated. The sheriff picked up the coins, turned them over, and finally nodded toward a shelf. Hawk took what he needed and left without another word. But as he stepped outside, he felt their eyes on his back, hungry, watchful, waiting. When he returned to the cabin, the light had dimmed to gold and ash. Lucinda sat beside her father, humming softly, a tune so faint it might have been mistaken for wind. She looked up as Hawk entered, relief flashing across her face. "Did they give you any trouble?" He set the bottle down. "Nothing worth remembering." She gave a small, tired smile. "You always talk like that, half meanin', half peace." "Best way to stay alive," he said, and handed her the medicine. They worked through the night tending Rufus, the fire burning low and hot. Hawk made broth. Lucinda coaxed her father to sip water. Once, near midnight, the old man opened his eyes. His gaze wandered before finding Hawk. You're Redfeather's boy," he rasped. Hawk nodded. "Yes, sir." Rufus's lips twitched. "Your father was a hard man." "So I'm told." "You got his shoulders," the old man wheezed, "but not his hate. That's a mercy, son. Don't lose it." He fell silent after that, breath rattling until it grew still. Lucinda froze, hand still clutching his wrist. For a moment, the world seemed to pause around her. Then softly she said, "Pa?" No answer. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful, it was hollow, echoing, immense. Lucinda bowed her head, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Hawk stood beside her, saying nothing because there was nothing to say that didn't sound like theft. When the first light of morning touched the window, they buried Rufus Bell on the hill behind the cabin. The snow had crusted over the earth, and each strike of Hawk's shovel rang like metal on stone. Lucinda helped, her fingers raw, her face pale with grief. They didn't speak, not until the last handful of soil fell against the wooden cross Hawk had carved. "I can't even pray," she whispered. "The words won't come." "Then be silent," Hawk said. "Sometimes silence is closer to heaven than speech." She looked at him, eyes red-rimmed. "You talk like a preacher. Maybe just a man who's heard too much thunder." Her laugh was broken, but it was still a laugh, and for that he was grateful. Days passed. Grief settled into the corners of the cabin like dust. Lucinda worked without asking for help, fetching water, patching clothes, keeping the place clean as though order itself could keep sorrow from rotting the heart. Hawk gave her space, though every quiet hour made him more aware of her nearness, the soft scrape of her chair, the sound of her humming at dusk. One evening he found her outside, kneeling by the grave. The snow had started again, fine and steady. He stood a few paces away, unsure whether to approach. "You think he's warm?" she asked without turning. Hawk hesitated. "I think he's free." "That's not the same," she said softly. "Freedom's cold." He stepped closer. "So's truth." But both beat the lie of comfort. She turned then, looking up at him through the falling snow. "You speak in riddles. Life taught me that straight talk don't heal much." She smiled faintly. "Maybe that's why you're alone." "Maybe." He met her gaze. "Or maybe it's because no one's asked to stay." Something flickered in her eyes, but before she could speak, a sound cut through the stillness, the distant thud of hooves. They turned toward the valley just as 2 riders emerged from the white haze, moving slow but sure toward the cabin. Hawk's jaw tightened. "Stay inside." Lucinda obeyed without protest, retreating to the doorway as the men dismounted. One was Sheriff Harlow, the other Tommy Greaves. Their horses stamped impatiently, nostrils steaming. "Afternoon," the sheriff called, though his smile carried no warmth. "Heard you had company up here." Hawk didn't answer. Greaves spat into the snow. "We came for what's owed." Bell's debt didn't die with him. Lucinda stepped forward, voice sharp. "You'll get nothing from us." The sheriff's gaze slid to her, slow and deliberate. "Us, huh? Sounds like you're claiming the Apache now." Hawk took a step closer, his voice quiet but cutting. "Leave." Harlow chuckled. "You don't make the laws, Red Feather." "No," Hawk said. "But I make the ground you'll walk on if you keep pushing." The sheriff's hand hovered near his pistol, but Greaves placed a hand on his arm. "Not today," he muttered. "Snow's too thick for blood." They turned their horses and rode off, leaving silence in their wake. But Hawk knew this was only the beginning. That night, the fire burned low again, and the air between them was heavy with what hadn't been said. Lucinda sat near the hearth, her face ghosted by shadow. "They'll come back," she said. "Yes. And you'll fight them." "If I have to." She looked up, anger flaring through her grief. "What? Why always fighting, always silence? Can't you let someone else bear it for once?" He met her gaze steadily. "Because I've seen what happens when no one stands." Her voice softened. "And what happens when you stand alone?" He didn't answer. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks upward. Lucinda rose and crossed to him. "You don't have to keep proving you're not your father," she said. "No one's judging you here." He froze. The words hit something deep, something he thought he'd buried long ago. "You think that's what this is?" She nodded. "You carry his name like it's a punishment." For a long time he said nothing. Then quietly, "A man's name is the first chain he's given. I've spent my life trying to break mine." Her hand rose, hesitated, then rested lightly on his arm. "You already have." He looked at her, really looked, and saw not pity but truth. And it frightened him more than any storm. Outside, the wind began to howl again, fierce and sudden. From the dark beyond the window, a faint glimmer appeared, lanterns moving fast through the trees. Hawk's eyes narrowed. They didn't wait long. Lucinda turned toward the sound, her breath catching. "Who?" He reached for his rifle, loading it with calm precision. "The kind of men who don't come to talk." The light flickered closer, a dozen shapes emerging from the storm, their voices rising with the wind. The storm had come again, but this time it wore faces. The wind screamed against the cabin walls, a sound like the valley itself was alive and angry. The lantern flame fluttered, thin and nervous, as Hawk loaded the rifle with deliberate calm. Lucinda stood beside the hearth, her face pale, her breath trembling in the half-light. Outside, the storm churned, but beneath it came another sound, the crunch of boots on snow, the low murmur of men who had come not for talk, but for blood. "They'll kill you," she whispered. Hawk's gaze never wavered from the door. "Not if I see them first." Her voice broke. "You can't fight them all." He gave a small, humorless smile. "Then I'll start with the loudest." He moved to the window and peeked through the frost-slicked glass. Shapes moved beyond the treeline, lanterns swaying, shadows long and crooked. He counted 6, maybe 7. They fanned out, cautious, knowing whose ground they'd come to trespass. Lucinda reached for his arm, but he shook his head gently. "Stay low. When I step out, bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." She wanted to argue, to demand he stay inside, but the look in his eyes silenced her. There was no fear there, only something older, steadier. The kind of resolve that had weathered too many storms to believe in safety. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a slap, sharp and clean. Snow bit his face, wind tugged at his hair. The night was full of motion, lantern lights swaying, guns glinting, breath fogging in the air. He moved with the quiet of a hunter, his boots making no sound on the frozen ground. "Red Feather," a voice called out through the storm. It was Sheriff Harlow, his tone thick with liquor and pride. "Step on out now. You've been harboring debtors and thieves. Law says that makes you one yourself." Hawk stopped a few paces from the porch. "Law don't mean much when it's written by cowards." Laughter rippled through the men, thin and nervous. Greaves stepped forward, his hand on the butt of his pistol. "Where's the girl, Hawk? We just want what's owed. Hand her over and we'll leave your carcass for the crows to chew later." Hawk lifted his rifle, the barrel steady despite the wind. "You'll take no one from here." The silence that followed was as taut as wire. Then a single shot cracked the night. Snow leapt at Hawk's feet, and everything erupted at once. Gunfire shattered the storm's rhythm, flashes of light cutting through the dark. Hawk fired twice, dropping one man who'd broken left. Another stumbled behind a tree, cursing. The rest fanned out, shouting over the wind. The air filled with the smell of gunpowder and the sharp tang of blood. Inside, Lucinda pressed herself against the door, her heart hammering. Every shot felt like a blow to her chest. She wanted to run to him, to drag him back to safety, but she remembered his voice, steady, certain, and forced herself to stay. Outside, Hawk moved like smoke, like something that belonged to the night more than the living. He ducked behind a fallen log, reloaded, and fired again. A scream split the air. 2 men left. Then a sudden, deafening silence. He listened. Nothing but the wind. He stood slowly, scanning the tree line. That was when he heard the crunch behind him, too close, too soft. He spun just as Greaves lunged from the darkness, knife flashing. The blade caught Hawk's shoulder, hot pain blooming under his coat. He swung the rifle stock up, hard, catching Greaves across the jaw. The man fell to his knees, spitting blood and snow. "You should have stayed in town," Hawk said, voice low. Greaves grinned through broken teeth. "Town's comin' to you, Redfeather. You and that whore'll hang before spring." The words hit like ice. Hawk's jaw tightened. He lifted the rifle again, but before he could pull the trigger, another voice cut through the storm. "Stop." Lucinda stood at the cabin door, her shawl whipping in the wind, eyes bright with something fiercer than fear. She held her father's pistol, small, rusted, but steady in her hand. "Lucinda, get inside." Hawk barked. Greaves laughed, blood running from his mouth. "Ain't she sweet? Thought you had yourself a servant, didn't ya, Apache? Turns out she's just another." The shot cracked sharp and final. Greaves jerked once, eyes wide, and fell back into the snow. Hawk turned to her slowly. The pistol trembled in her hands, smoke rising from its barrel. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Only the storm moved between them, cold and alive. Then she dropped the gun, her breath breaking in sobs she couldn't contain. Hawk crossed the space between them in 2 strides, catching her as her knees buckled. He held her close, his arm tight around her shoulders, his blood soaking into her sleeve. "I know," he said softly. "It's over." But it wasn't. The sheriff was still out there. As if summoned by thought, Harlow's voice came from the trees. "Redfeather, you think this ends tonight? You just murdered a white man." Hawk turned, pushing Lucinda gently toward the cabin. Inside. She shook her head, tears freezing on her cheeks. "No, not this time. I'm done hiding." He hesitated, then nodded once. The 2 of them stood together in the falling snow, side by side beneath the gray sky. The sheriff stepped into view, gun drawn, lantern swinging from his other hand. His face was pale and hard, the kind of man who believed cruelty was the same as strength. "Step aside, girl," he said. "He's a killer." Lucinda raised her chin. "So are you." Harlow sneered. "You don't know what you're defending." "I know he's the only man who's ever treated me like more than something owed." Her voice didn't shake. The sheriff's mouth tightened. He cocked the pistol, aiming at Hawk's chest. "Then you'll die for your mistake." The world seemed to hold its breath. Hawk's eyes narrowed, his hand hovering near his belt knife. Snowflakes drifted between them like slow-burning embers. Then Harlow fired. The sound shattered the night. Lucinda flinched, but Hawk didn't fall. The sheriff stared down at his pistol, eyes wide, as blood bloomed suddenly across his own coat. Behind him stood one of the wounded men, trembling, the barrel of his own gun still smoking. "Enough," the man rasped. "Ain't worth dying for your hate, Mason." The sheriff fell to his knees, then to the snow. The light went out of him before he hit the ground. The man who'd fired dropped his gun and turned away into the storm, disappearing into white. For a long while there was no sound but the wind. Hawk exhaled slowly. Lucinda stood frozen, staring at the blood mixing with snow. Then her eyes met his, and something in both of them broke open. He reached for her hand, and she took it without hesitation. "It's done," he said. "No," she whispered. "It's beginning." They stood like that until the lanterns guttered out and the valley swallowed the last of the storm's anger. When dawn came, it was gentle, gold spilling across the hills, the snow gleaming soft and clean. Hawk's wound had been bound, his arm in a sling. Lucinda moved quietly around the cabin, her face calmer now, her steps sure. Outside, the first hints of thaw had begun, the snow retreating in thin lines, the creek whispering faintly under the ice. They worked together that morning, saying little. When the sun rose higher, Hawk sat on the porch, sharpening a knife with his good hand. Lucinda brought him coffee and stood beside him, watching the light creep across the valley. I keep thinking about last night, she said. So do I. I thought I'd never stop shaking. But now, she paused, looking out toward the hills. Now it feels like something's been buried and something else has been born. He nodded. Sometimes you have to burn the old world to make room for the new. She smiled faintly. You talk like a poet. Just a man who's seen too many endings. And maybe, she said softly, one beginning. He looked at her, sunlight catching the strands of her hair, and for once the silence between them was light, not heavy. She reached for his hand and didn't let go. From the porch, the land stretched wide and clean, the scars of the storm already softening beneath the morning. Far below, in the valley, the snow melted into rivulets that glimmered like veins of silver, carrying the past away with them. Hawk squeezed her hand once, firm and sure. We'll build a fence tomorrow, he said. Lucinda smiled. And after that? He turned to her, eyes warm for the first time in years. After that we live. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of thawing earth and pine. Above them, a hawk circled against the pale blue sky, wings spread wide, calling once, a long, low cry that faded into peace. The world had changed, and so had they.